Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site virtually this evening for our History at Night program for January of 2022. For those of you that are first timers, we welcome you here. If you're a frequent flyer with us, we appreciate your support. This is a program sponsored by the Friends of the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. And on behalf of the Friends and the Historic Sites Division of the Texas Historical Commission, we thank you for joining us for this exploration of Texas history. We're going to have some fun tonight talking with some of my colleagues in a bit of a Texas Revolution roundtable, hopefully touching on some topics that might surprise you a little bit, just about our experiences with visitors and what we hear them share with us or expect from us or find surprising about us when they come and visit our sites. So I'm very pleased. Again, I'm Brian McCauley, the site manager here at San Felipe de Austin. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you tonight's panel. Our first representative is going to be Andy Smith, who's here from representing San Jacinto Battlefield, State Historic Site. Andy has been with the state of Texas for 15 years, since 2006, when he began work at the Battleship Texas, and has been with the San Jacinto facility over the last 3 years. Andy is a third-generation Houstonian and a sixth-generation Texan. He is a graduate of the University of Houston in the anthropology department, has done a number of storied jobs related to that. We're thrilled to have him here as part of the Texas history team. You're going to hear a little more about Kreischer Brewery here in a second at the end of our program. Next on our agenda this evening is Jordan Anderson, a colleague of mine here at San Felipe de Austin. Jordan obtained his bachelor's degree from Northern Arizona University in fisheries and wildlife management. After spending time working in West Texas and Wyoming, he discovered a way to pursue his true passion of history. He worked for almost 7 years at the Jordan Bachman Pioneer Farm in Austin, Texas, and has then moved on to work at the Washington-on-the-Brazos State Historic Site, and came to work with us here at San Felipe de Austin in 2020. And then lastly, Kevin Malcolm is the lead interpreter at Washington-on-the-Brazos State Historic Site and Independence Hall. He's a graduate of Texas A&M University with a Sorry, I think we had a technical glitch. I hope that I'm back. Kevin is a graduate of Texas A&M from a degree in history in 2013. He served in the Texas Army National Guard, began his career with the Historical Commission at Fort McCavitt in Menard County, interpreting the U.S. Army on the Texas frontier. He came to Washington-on-the-Brazos in November of 2020 after years of volunteering and performing an outreach at several Texas Revolution historic sites. His primary area of interest is in the social and political history of the Texas Revolution. So we're really excited to have these three guys here to share some thoughts about their historic sites with you. There will be a question and answer opportunity at the end of our session. I'll come back and help you all through that. Please respond with any questions you may have throughout the evening with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, gentlemen, let's have some fun night with Texas history. Thank you.
All right, I get to lead off with this first question. Are there aspects of your site story that surprise visitors? I think one of the most surprising things, seemingly, is this is where we won our independence. Texas won its independence here at San Jacinto, April 21st, 1836. A lot of people really connect more with another site. Flag up in my background is familiar to some of y'all. But San Jacinto has been a popular memorial and recreational site ever since that fateful day in April, and went on to become the first state park in 1907, and was really the preeminent tourist attraction memorial in the whole state of Texas until infamous movie came out in the 1960s. And I think at that time period, people got a fascination with the Alamo, which obviously is a significant story in the Texas Revolution. But San Jacinto stands as where we won our independence. And I think the memorialization and the significance of the battle that occurred here is sometimes overshadowed in some people's mind by the tragedy that occurred in San Antonio. And I think a lot of visitors are surprised when they come here and realize that the Texas Revolution wasn't just the Alamo.
And then one of the things, the aspects of the site that surprise our visitors is the long history San Felipe de Austin has with organizing the government. There were conventions here in 1832 and 33 that sent recommendations to the Mexican government. And before we declared independence and met at Washington-on-the-Brazos, there was a temporary government organized here. The consultation was held in November of 1835. It was even supposed to begin before then. However, the Battle of Gonzales kind of got in the way. A number of the delegates decided to join the militias and go fight. And then once the fighting kind of died down outside of San Antonio during the siege, they returned for the political meeting. Declared support for the Mexican Constitution of 1824 during that meeting and set up a state government. And even before that consultation meeting in November, there was a council here that was helping to supply and organize the militia during that intermediary time where we weren't quite sure what we were doing, but we knew we were fighting the Mexican
army. So I think there's so many things. Again, it's hard to say what it's hard to pin down one specific thing that often surprises visitors, because Washington-on-the-Brazos, while a lot of folks recognize it as, you know, the place where independence was declared, the birthplace of Texas, there's so much more to the story. And to me, I think one of the things that is particularly surprising to students of Texas history, and I don't just mean grade students, but also students, you know, adults who spend a lot of time studying Texas history, is that on February 29th, the day before the convention here in Washington begins, independence was not necessarily inevitable. As Jordan mentioned from the consultation, when Texas politicians gathered there and organized the state government, there was a question on what exactly is this war that we've now found ourselves in for several weeks. What is it exactly that we're fighting for? Because very prominent Texans, you know, Stephen F. Austin among them, were big supporters of Mexican federalism and joining in a counter-revolution against Santa Anna, but weren't necessarily seeking to break Texas off into its own nation or to join the United States. And I think when I interact with visitors and with those who are attending, you know, those school groups who come in and talk to us about that, I have to remind them that this was a pretty close run thing in the late weeks of 1835 and the early part of 1836. Now, as we know, the Texas Declaration of Independence was unanimously adopted on March 2nd, but that's only because the voice of the people of Texas had spoken in the elections that were held in February. You know, this became the first capital of the Republic of Texas, kind of unofficially, because the government, as soon as the government was organized, they joined in the runaway scrape and left here on March 17th. But then it would be the final capital of the Republic of Texas from September of 1842 until fall of 1845. But Texas declared independence here in the town of Washington in 1836. But this was also the site that Texas declared its dependence upon the United States in 1845. Interestingly enough, in the exact same building. So this is it's a special place, and when I talk to visitors about that, they often have some pretty amazed reactions at that information. So as you can see here, the next thing we're going to talk about is sort of unique unusual connections between our sites and other places within the Texas independent story. And I get the privilege of leading this one off, and it's undeniable that Washington-on-the-Brazos is connected with Texas revolutionary sites, not just the ones that are represented here, San Felipe, San Jacinto, and us. Washington-on-the-Brazos is connected with Gonzales. Sam Houston left Washington to go to Gonzales on March 6th. He left the convention after being an elected delegate and being appointed the commander-in-chief. Obviously, Sam Houston would go on to lead the army at San Jacinto. San Felipe, the consultation would be directly preliminary, and as Jordan alluded to, the politics of the Texas Revolution have been going on for several years before it finally culminates and crescendos here in the town of Washington. But to me, I think one of the most poignant and sort of emotional connections that we share with the greater Texas Revolutionary story are a series of letters that were written by Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett Travis within the walls of the Alamo during the siege, during the 13-day siege there in late February and early March. Most folks in Texas history and really even folks in American history, we're all familiar with the February 24th letter that Travis wrote that's addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. And it ends with the words victory or death. But to me, one of, that letter is a rallying cry for reinforcement, for aid. But several days into the siege, you can kind of see the shift in morale inside the Alamo through a couple of letters that Travis wrote on March 3rd, the day after independence was declared. And one in particular, he wrote to Jesse Grimes. Now, Jesse Grimes was a resident of what became Grimes County. He was an elected delegate from the Washington district, and he was representing the people of Washington and the surrounding area at the convention of 1836. And his son was serving under Travis's command inside the walls of the Alamo. And Travis writes to Jesse Grimes. He writes a letter that I'm going to paraphrase a quote here real briefly, but he says, "Let the convention go on and make a declaration of independence so that we will know and the world will know what we are fighting for. For if independence is declared, then I shall fight on as a soldier who fights or who does his duty. But if independence should not be declared, then I shall lay down my sword." And that really speaks to sort of the central position that Washington held for those just over 2 weeks in the hearts and minds of all Texans who sought independence and a better way forward in 1835.
I think one of the unique connections San Jacinto has, and Kevin spoke to this, and I'm sure Jordan will too. This is a story as big as Texas, right? The Texas Revolution, and it was going all over the state. It was really concentrated in a small area relative to the greater size of Texas, but the unique characters involved, and we always talk about Austin, who was everywhere, and Sam Houston, which Kevin spoke, and Travis, and the heroes of the Alamo. But there's any number of people that were connected to all these sites. Two of my favorites have an intimate connection to San Jacinto, and that's Lorenzo de Zavala and David Burnett, who at the time of the Battle of San Jacinto were the president and vice president of the newly formed, March 2nd, thanks to WAB, Republic of Texas. But these men knew each other, and it's almost a microcosm of the story of Texas. You had David Burnett, who's a man from New Jersey, and you have Lorenzo de Zavala, who's a Mexican born in the Yucatan. And they knew each other before they came to Texas. They were associated in New York, and they were friends. And they ended up both getting impresarios and settling in the vicinity of San Jacinto, the battlefield. I don't know if it was complete happenstance that the battle happened here, right adjacent to land they owned, and there they are, president and vice president. But De Zavala at times was at WAB, he was at San Felipe. Burnett lived in San Felipe in when he first got here. And both of them were just dynamic individuals. Lorenzo de Zavala is probably arguably the single most important person in the Texas Revolution in a lot of aspects. I mean, he wrote the Constitution, or was part of writing the Constitution in 1824, that was really instrumental in changing Mexican becoming an independent state from Spain. And then Santa Anna rejecting that Constitution in 1824. That's that flag up there. The Alamo most likely flew that flag because they weren't initially, Texas was not initially arguing for independence. They were arguing to adhere to that Constitution that de Zavala was. I mean, he was the Thomas Jefferson of the Mexican Revolution. And then during the Texas Revolution, he was an integral part in writing the Constitution, the Texas Constitution for the Republic. That man was all over. He even was governor of Mexico for a term and got exiled and got on Santa Anna's bad list. And that's when he became a doctor and learned the medical trade. And he settled right across the bayou from where we are now at San Jacinto and had his homestead there. And it was used as a field hospital throughout the Texas Revolution. You know, the battle was fought where you could almost watch it from his front porch. Burnett, on the other hand, a pretty dynamic individual in his own. He tried his to settle here in Texas and actually purchased a 15 horsepower steam sawmill and tried to set up shop along the Buffalo Bayou, operating a sawmill, but it ultimately failed in 1835. And you know, the two men and their interconnections, like I said, they were in San Felipe, they were in Wab, they were integral parts throughout the revolution. They knew each other. And again, they were the first president and vice president of the Republic of Texas. Burnett ended up escorting Santa Anna back and gotten a little bit of, there was some talk of him being a traitor because he was one of the big advocates for not killing Santa Anna on the spot. So he ended up escorting Santa Anna, ultimately being part of the Treaty of Velasco, which ultimately gave Texas its independence. But there were a lot of people that wanted Santa Anna dead. You know, when you talk about the Alamo, when you talk about Goliad, those are the two massacres that occurred in the Texas Revolution, the big ones. And there was a lot of bloodshed, and there was strong feelings that Santa Anna was a monster and needed to be killed. But I think Burnett's knowledge overall and his relationship with de Zavala and the understanding of the politics of it all, he was cognizant of the fact that if they killed Santa Anna right then and there, they really had no bargaining chip. There was no, they had the president of Mexico. So whatever they told him to do, he'd probably have to do. And Sam Houston immediately asked or demanded Santa Anna send all his troops home, because the dirty secret is Texas was completely outnumbered. And even after the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican troops that were still there in Texas could have easily come in and wiped out anything the Texans could have put together. There was a small contingent force of the Mexicans, relatively speaking, here at San Jacinto. And I'll talk more about the actual battle here, of course. But, you know, our winning of independence here at San Jacinto was contingent on the acts of both de Zavala and Burnett and their relationship to the other sites in the overall region. And there, you know, again, you have basically an American and a Mexican getting together. Isn't that what Texas kind of is? So I just really love that interconnectedness. And Burnett and de Zavala don't often get as much press, if you will, as the more famous Sam Houston and Austin and of course Travis. So those are my interconnected ones.
Mm-hmm. And to add to what Andy said about Lorenzo de Zavala, he was here during the consultation in 1835 and helped draft the Solemn Declaration, which is the document that stated, we are in support of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. We don't like Santa Anna, and we are not at this time declaring independence, though they didn't rule that out. And to that point, unusual connections that we have between each of the sites. We know that each of the municipalities in the run-up to the convention at Washington-on-the-Brazos had to elect their own delegates. the newspaper that was printing here in town ran the delegates, ran the names of the people and what their positions were, whether or not they were for independence or whether or not they were a constitutionalist. And the delegates that came from this municipality were all constitutionalists. However, they rather quickly got on board at Washington-on-the-Brazos. Independence was pretty much decided on March 1st. They were just waiting for a draft declaration on the 2nd and then signing it on the 3rd. It was a pretty quick transition when the convention convened there in Washington. And while all those people are gathering at Washington, William B. Travis at the Alamo, he's writing his letters. He's sending those letters to San Felipe. That's where he expects the government to be. So we're kind of the go-between. The letters are arriving here, then they're being sent up to Washington-on-the-Brazos. However, one thing Washington-on-the-Brazos did not have was a printing press, a quick and efficient way to get the news out. San Felipe did. In fact, the printer here thought about moving his press up to Washington, heard another printer was going to do it, decided it wasn't worth it, I'll just stay in San Felipe. That other guy never showed up. So as a result, the Telegraph and Texas Register, the printing press that's operating on that, is sharing the news of the Declaration of Independence. They're printing up 1,000 copies and distributing it on behalf of this new government that's being formed at Washington, sharing the news. We've declared independence, printing out numerous different government documents to share. That printing press also happened to start operating here in town right before the Battle of Gonzales. So not only is it the mouthpiece for the government at Washington, but it was the mouthpiece for the government, the temporary government that was operating at San Felipe during the early days of the revolution. So they're right there at the heartbeat. And, we have the brains meeting at Washington-on-the-Brazos, but we're the speaking piece, we're the microphone. All right. For San Felipe, one of the misunderstandings that people have about our story is that many people know the town burns. And during the revolution, it is most commonly assigned to who is perceived to be the guilty party, the bad guy. In this case, it's going to be Santa Anna. That is not the case for San Felipe. The town was burned by its own militia. And we know that it was kind of an attempt to, if we're not going to leave anything behind. And the town's burning, on, at least locally, was ordered by this guy over my shoulder, Mosley Baker. He was a captain of the local militia. Set fire to his own office, ordered many of the town residents to set fire to their own businesses and homes. Very unpopular decision. And there's still controversy about who actually ordered the town to be burned, whether or not it was Sam Houston or Mosley Baker. Both of those two people point directly at each other because, fun fact, who wants to take credit for unpopular decision? So no one ever raises their hand for that. So they kind of point the finger at each other. But we, for a fact, know it was not Santa Anna. The town set fire, the people of the town set fire to San Felipe. And then they retreated east. The town militia did stay here for about 5 years. There wasn't much of a skirmish. There were some shots exchanged back and forth, but Santa Anna would be here. And only one person died during the Mexican Army's occupation of the ashes of San Felipe. And his name was John Bricker. And he was hit by the Mexican cannons when he was on the east bank of the Brazos River. We do know from an account from one of the Mexican officers who were passing through San Felipe, saying that he thought it was a terrible loss that the town didn't need to be set on fire. However, he did indicate that they were hopeful some of the buildings were intact so that they could build rafts to cross the Brazos with. They stayed here for about 5 days and then found a crossing further south of here. They being the Mexican Army, of course.
I guess on Washington's side for misunderstandings or misperceptions. Washington-on-the-Brazos in Texas's history really only ever occupies that, politically, I won't even, in deference to Andy and the significance of San Jacinto, the politically climactic moment of Texas independence and the formation of the first interim republic or government for the republic. But when we look at Washington on the whole, its story is only really just beginning in 1836. When I talk to the public and I give the story, give the history and the story of this place, I usually begin in 1821 with the arrival of Andrew Robinson. In 1822, this became a ferry crossing over the Brazos River with the Lava Hia Road. But to me, I think one of my favorite quotes about the town of Washington comes from Colonel William Fairfax Gray's diary, where he describes Washington in 1836. Now, keep in mind, this is Washington only a couple of weeks before the convention, the big climax of the political revolution in Texas occurs. He describes Washington as 24 or so wretched cabins or shanties laid out on a single stump-lined street in the middle of the woods. And that's obviously not exactly a great, he obviously wasn't too impressed with what he found here in Washington. But like I said, 1836, Washington is still a rough young town, but it sits as a crossroad. And Jordan mentioned the burning of San Felipe and the loss of that town, and that was true of many places in Texas. Gonzales would face a similar fate. Washington didn't have that. Washington would remain completely intact. It was bypassed by General Filisola's army column as Santa Anna's army moved eastward, because once the government had abandoned the town, there was no real military significance here anymore. But Washington, afterward, when the citizens would return, Washington would grow and thrive in the Republic period because it sits at what we call the crossroads of water and dirt, the Lava Hia Road and the Brazos River, with that ferry crossing, being an intact town in the post-revolutionary period, and then growing into not just a major city because of that, but also an inland port. Gulf of Mexico steamers would steam all the way up the Brazos River, finding that anywhere further north along the Brazos was blocked by Hidalgo Falls, a water feature about 8 or so miles north or further upriver from Washington. This city would grow from a population of 120 in 1836 to nearly 2,000 in the early years of Texas statehood in the 1850s. Shops, businesses, folks living here, quarters, hotels, all of that would be found here in Washington. And, when you come to Washington, until recently we were a state park, and folks come here and they see the trees and the grass and the beautiful wildflowers in the springtime. And this used to look like any downtown, small town Texas that you might see today with, shops and buildings and all of that. And I think folks, until they know the story, they don't see that. They think of this as, Independence Hall, and that's the story of Washington is 17 days in March. And I just think that there's a lot about that. Now, something else that I did want to mention is when we think about the Texas Declaration of Independence, we had 59 signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. Nowadays, it's very popular to talk about, I was born here, native Texan, and things like that. There were only 2 people who were signatories to the Texas Declaration of Independence that were actually born within the borders of Texas. Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz. Navarro was Ruiz's nephew. Both were representatives from the Behar district from San Antonio. We'll talk a little bit more about Jose Navarro a little bit towards the end of the program. But, Texas was wrought as an independent nation largely by folks who had come here only in the years or even in the weeks leading up to Texas Independence Day. George Childress, most famously among them, had only lived in Texas for a handful of weeks before independence was declared, and he was the primary author of Texas independence. So I think, nowadays, like I said, it's very popular to talk about native Texans and things like that. Texas was built largely on the back of folks coming here from other places. Like Andy mentioned earlier, our first president was from New Jersey. Thank you.
It pains me to hear that and say that, but it is the reality. I think the biggest misunderstanding we have here at San Jacinto is it was an 18-minute battle. I mean, obviously, everyone knows that that's what it's famous for. It was quick, decisive victory. The reality was the military aspect of it occurred in about 18 minutes before the Mexican line was overrun by the Texans. But it was a 3-day conflict, and the battle, if you will, on the 21st raged on into the evening. There was a lot leading up to San Jacinto. My colleagues Jordan and Kevin have talked about a lot of it. The military, basically Santa Anna was pursuing the leadership of Texas. The leadership of Texas was fleeing east. Sam Houston was acting as a rear guard for the runaway scrape, which is probably one of the biggest stories of the Texas Revolution. It really impacts San Felipe and Washington-on-the-Brazos. San Felipe more, as Jordan just talked about. But Santa Anna and Sam Houston met here prior to April 21st. They were here on the 20th. They skirmished. That could have gone any number of ways. That's where Mirabeau B. Lamar, our second full president, gained his spurs, if you will, and became famous. But that skirmish, easily shows and lets everyone know on both sides, both armies knew they were here. There was no secret ambush that Sam Houston had of Santa Anna. Sometimes that's one that's thrown out, that Sam Houston ambushed Santa Anna's army. No, they skirmished the day before, and they set up their camps, and they basically knew where each other's camps were. They were basically almost within sight of each other. And the battle on the 21st, how and why it occurred, we could probably have many webinars about that itself. But Sam Houston decided to attack Santa Anna's line in the afternoon. Santa Anna was probably not expecting it. I mean, from everything that we know, reports after, actions during, that his armies are not prepared. But what army would be prepared? We're talking Napoleonic warfare. You wouldn't do that. Sam Houston acted well outside of the bounds of normal military behavior. Nothing surprising there. The other aspect, besides it being that 18-minute battle, is it was very one-sided from a number standpoint. The militaries were actually pretty even, relatively speaking, especially with Costas reinforcements arriving the morning of the 21st. The numbers on both sides were about equal. I mean, it wasn't too far off. Mexican army had kind of moved ahead of its main body, so the rest of the army, as we mentioned earlier, was not at San Jacinto. Some of the more elite, if you will, portions of Santa Anna's armies were there, but they were tired. They'd been marching, forced marched, especially Costas had really gotten here. Santa Anna definitely had the advantage with cavalry. His Mexican cavalry was some of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. So when Sam Houston brought his forces to bear at Santa Anna, there was a fight. The Mexican cannons fired, the Texans cannons fired. It was 2 cannons to 1, the Twin Sisters versus El Volcan, or the Golden Standard, whichever phrase you want to use for it. but it was taken out quickly. The Texans broke through the line, the Mexican breastworks fairly quickly, and started the rout. So the 18 minutes, it describes that initial breakthrough and basically routing the Mexican army. After that is where the real slaughter took place. And even some of the Texan officers, I wouldn't go as far as saying ashamed, but they were trying in some cases to stop the slaughter, the massacre of the Mexicans. From the Texan standpoint, they knew about Goliad, they knew about the Alamo, they were out for blood. From the Mexican standpoint, they knew about Goliad, they knew about the Alamo, they were running for their life. And the peninsula that San Jacinto is, and that variation from tall grass prairie to marsh is very hard to distinguish, especially if you're from, say, central Mexico and you're a soldier and you start running in the grass and you keep going and you hit marsh, it leads to you not being able to get away, and burning Vince's Bridge, all of the things that were tactically done where Santa Anna contributed to a slaughter. Sam Houston referred to 620 dead Mexican soldiers laid here at San Jacinto, to about 9 Texans that ultimately paid the price here. So that aspect of it being, 18-minute battle, you had the 21st, you had the 20th, and then you had the capture of Santa Anna the next day and him brought back and surrendering to Sam Houston, and Sam Houston sparing his life, and then ultimately shipping him off to sign the Treaty of Velasco really is what won independence. But the activities that occurred at San Jacinto were much larger than a simple 18-minute battle. The slaughter was understandable, I think, from everyone's perspective, but it was terrible. The Mexican soldiers were pretty much left to rot on the ground. I mean, Audubon came afterwards and collected skulls. That's how we know some of the physical characteristics of some of the Mexican soldiers. Peggy McCormick, the widow who owned the land, sued both the Mexican, or tried to sue the Mexican government, and tried to sue the Texas government to do something with the bodies, and both governments refused to do anything. And she finally hired some ranch hands to create mass burial. So I think the aspect of it being an 18-minute battle is, I guess, technically correct, but it really leaves out a lot of details. And then the other aspect, this is a memorial. This is sacred ground. This is where men fought and died, and there's many, many graves here. Very, very few of them are actually associated with the Battle of San Jacinto. And the biggest grave is mass graves, and we don't know where they are. There are literally hundreds of Mexicans buried throughout these grounds, and we do not know where they are. So we tend to view this as very sacred soil because, and my colleague Kevin can understand this, I think, really well, being a veteran. Men don't care which flag they're flying on ultimately when they're fighting and they die. They did it for what they felt was a noble cause. They paid the ultimate price to the country or the flag they claim loyalty to, and those fallen, I think universally there's a sense of respect for that. So the San Jacinto Monument, the Brigham Monument, all these monuments are put here to recognize that those sacrifices made and ultimately the blood that was shed for this independence. So I think a lot of people don't really catch the nuance that this is much more complicated than 18-minute battle, and this is truly sacred soil that they're on. I think that is something that I try to convey, and I feel very strongly about. So I was talking about the memorialization, and to me, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of how we understand our history is, we're doing this webinar, but we have these sites that were set aside as memorials. And I'm always just endlessly fascinated on how we've memorialized San Jacinto and other sites, but San Jacinto is where I'm at. So one of the things I learned recently is you know, in the 1890s, the surviving, the survivors, the veterans of the Battle of San Jacinto were brought together by the Daughters of the Republic, and they came out, and Winters, Hill, some of the famous gentlemen that were involved that were alive and veterans came out and identified significant areas and went on to help us establish a museum and a monument. Winters especially was out 1890s and identified the locations of significant aspects of the battle. And they put iron crosses there. And one of those battle significant portions of the battlefield was the surrender tree for where Stan Houston met Santa Anna, and Santa Anna was brought before him and surrendered. You know, and two aspects that I learned recently. I've always seen, and I think it was referenced, I've always thought of it as being one of these beautiful live oaks we find along, you know, coastal prairie here in Texas. But in all actuality, it was an elm tree, and we identified that recently and with a historic photo. But another aspect is that marker. You know, there was a gap. It was identified. You know, all those iron crosses were put down, but there wasn't one really put at the surrender tree at that time period because that land was not part of that initial acquisition by the Daughters in the state of Texas to memorialize San Jacinto, which ultimately we opened as a state, the first state park in 1907. So it didn't originally have a marker. That marker went up in 1909 or so. But then by about 1924, it was washed away. You know, Buffalo Bayou. I know my colleague Kevin over there was talking about the bustling town of Washington. Yeah, we were a little bit more a bustling town, I think, ultimately. So, you know, the expansion of Buffalo Bayou and you know, the ship channel up in 1914 really impacted the grounds here. And that marker was, that tree and marker were washed away, the surrender tree. And it wasn't until we came around in 1936 and celebrating the centennial that the marker we have and was put, but it's not the tree. The tree was not a live oak, and it was not originally affixed with a marker. And to me, that's some of that fascinating. Love doing my job. I get to learn, and every day, you know, we come in, we don't know exactly what we're going to be doing, but we end up learning something new. And the memorialization San Jacinto, and just that history of just simple thing like the granite markers we have. Well, they weren't originally granite. How did they get here? How did they figure out the location of them? How do we remember those men that fought and died? It's why we do what we do. And learning a little bit of tidbit, especially with something as famous in my mind as the surrender and where that took place is kind of cool to learn something new about it today.
So learn about something new recently. There are many things that we're still finding out about San Felipe. It is one of the younger sites. Our museum here has been here for close to 4 years now. We just opened up a new exhibit, the Via de Austin, where we've recreated a town block that was originally across the street from where we are now. So we're not covering up the archaeology that's still there. And because the site out here wasn't developed for a long period of time, there's still plenty of things for us to discover. At the site, we do have a temporary gallery. And in fact, that's where I am at this moment in time. And behind me is our current exhibit called Certificates of Character. So we took 12 different people that aren't as well known in Texas history, who lived here or had a footprint here for an extended period of time. And we thought we'd do a certificate and bring up some of their history. And it's also souvenir opportunities. So if you're in the area, please come visit us soon, and we will not be with us forever. But in performing the research for this, we discovered that 3 of the African-American stories here, those people encountered Santa Ana, and we're in the same physical space as them. One of them is Turner. He was here as a journeyman working with the printing press. So he was later captured at Harrisburg. You know, they evacuated the printing press so they could continue to print the newspaper and government documents. He was helping with the operation of that press. The pressman, Turner, were captured. The press was thrown into Buffalo Bayou and has never been recovered. And Turner kind of shows up at the Texas Army right before this Battle of San Jacinto and touts himself as being a spy and having relayed information to the Texas Army about the disposition of Santa Anna's army. There's, of course, Joe Travis, the body servant or a slave man that William Travis had at the Alamo, who was sent to San Felipe to deliver the news of the Alamo's fall and to help spread fear. Then we have town resident Celia Allen, who's really important to the story that we have here and to the recreation that we have outside in the town block. She was a free person of color living here in town who traded and sold some goods to the Mexican army and allegedly sold to Santa Ana. So those are the sorts of things that we're finding out all the time. The records are just kind of spread out because the town for a period of time kind of disappeared. You know, the population of San Felipe was 600 in 1836 or thereabouts, making it the second populous town in Texas. And it's about 850 people now. So, you know, we're growing slowly, but we're growing. But it does mean that quite a bit of our story is still out there and just haven't turned it over yet.
So one of the things that I'm particularly excited about for Washington and our story is talking about Washington or the site that would be Washington even before Mexican Texas became a reality. Washington and this area, the crossroads of the La Bahia Road and the Brazos River, has been a site that has been in the story of independence here in Texas before Mexico had even wrested its independence from Spain. We have a site here that was an earthenware fortification for filibusters from the Long expedition in 1819. Americans coming over, particularly under the command of James Long, although James Long didn't necessarily command here, it was one of his subordinate officers commanded here, but they had a company of filibusters who had come here and built an earthenware fort, an earthenworks fort, excuse me, in 1819 and 1820 as part of Long's expedition to assist in the independence of Mexico, or the independence of Mexico from Spain, of course, you know, follow on with later Texas independence and things like that, the expansion of the United States. But we're hoping in the not too distant future to start bringing that story more into focus, as well as bookending the story of Washington with sort of the fall and the demise of Washington. You know, for at least a decade, Washington, the site of where Texas became Texas, was cornfields and cotton fields, and there was very little here of any evidence at all that this was the site where Texas was born. And so I'm hoping to bring sort of the two bookends of our history, the pre-Mexican story and the post-revolutionary, post-Civil War history to life here in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for stuff going on here at Washington. And then, so our final question for this evening is share what we find most fascinating about the other sites that are represented here. And some of y'all are pretty knowledgeable. You come out to our sites, you interact with our staff. We have some volunteers here. We have other site staff, folks who spent time coming and visiting us. And for those of y'all who may not know this, there's a fun, wonderful rivalry between these three sites about who is the birthplace of Texas. Now, I mean, there we go. But what I think, what I find most interesting about that conversation is that all three sites have a very credible claim to that title. In the case of San Felipe, or for Washington, I mean, we call it the birthplace of Texas. What does that mean? How do we quantify that? I mean, I would argue that Washington is the birthplace of the Republic of Texas. But if that's true, San Felipe is absolutely the birthplace of Texas independence. Like Jordan said earlier, you have conventions going on that are trying to bring Texas into statehood, into Mexican statehood as early as 1832, and those are occurring in San Felipe. And then had it not been for the actions of Texans in San Felipe in 1835 at the consultation, then Washington would have just continued to be a town in the province. And so I'm particularly struck by San Felipe's role in this whole thing, particularly because once it was burned in 1836, a lot of that kind of falls away out of the direct consciousness of a lot of a lot of Texans. And then for San Jacinto, again, Kate several months ago argued that without a dramatic military victory, then the piece of paper that we wrote our independence on doesn't really mean anything. So I think San Jacinto is absolutely absolutely part of the story of the birthplace of Texas. But what I find most fascinating about it, and Andy alluded to this earlier, was when you look at the order of battle and you look at the roles and the rosters of who all fought in the Battle of San Jacinto, it's a who's who of Texas history. I mean, and we're not just talking about Sam Houston or Mirabeau Lamar, Thomas Rusk. I mean, so many people who maybe are only known in your local area, city founders of places like Houston and city fathers of Galveston and these other places. It seems to me that nearly anyone who is anyone in the early or in the Republic and early statehood history of Texas was either at San Jacinto or was in the vicinity of this great set piece battle that finally won Texas's independence. And I think, I've always really appreciated how, you learn about somebody in Texas history, like, where I used to live in Menard County. You look and you can see people like Menard was named after, and you can kind of trace that and go, oh, well, and there's now that connection back to San Jacinto. And I just find that fascinating.
Well, I obviously find it very fascinating that Washington-on-the-Brazos thinks they're the birthplace of Texas, but I won't. No, Kevin said it, the interconnectedness. I mean, THC, our agency has the tagline, "Real places telling real stories." I like to think of it as we're real places telling revolutionary stories. And I mean, the story of the Texas Revolution, I wish I could sit here and say it's just San Jacinto. Obviously, I think that's the most significant portion of it. It's in my blood. I can't think differently. But the reality is, it was a long story. Obviously not that long, relatively speaking. It was a months-long battle, but there's a lot leading up to it and a lot following it. Geographically, it was, basically you kind of have almost all of it between Brenham to Houston, at least a very significant portion. I mean, San Felipe is just, to me, fascinating because it is a great place to tell the story of the runaway scrape. And to me, that aspect of the Texas Revolution is often overlooked. I was in the Army. I get battles, guns are cool, cannons are fun, but most people are not going to associate with a soldier out on the field. That's the 1%. You know, very few have ever taken up arms, actually taken up arms. But everyone has had a crisis in their life and maybe had to, especially along the coast here, you have to evacuate for a hurricane. Imagine if that hurricane was the Mexican army bearing down on you, and you knew what happened at Goliad. You knew what happened in the Alamo in San Antonio. Imagine it's easy for us to place ourselves in those people's shoes, if you will. Sometimes lack of shoes because they were leaving that quickly. So to me, San Felipe really tells that emotional story, or helps tell that emotional story of the crucible that was the Texas Revolution. And of course, you know, we are a country of, even Texas was a country of documents. We agree upon things. We have, De Zavala wrote the Constitution basically for Mexico. He helped write the Constitution for Texas. We are a society that lives by rules and regulations. It's important. It defines who we are. And without the Washington on the Brazos, that definition to what we wanted to be, what we aspired to be, these truths we hold dear, if you will. You know, without Washington doing that, San Jacinto would have been meaningless. So to me, that interconnectedness, this story, this big story, the story as big as Texas, is just fascinating. You could actually hit all three of us in one day if you're really aggressive, and get all aspects of that story. To me, it's just it's a fascinating, and I'm so glad I get to work with these wonderful folks.
And the fascination that I have about all the sites, it's really, and Andy touched on it earlier, the people who made it through each and every one of these sites. Lorenzo de Zavala here as a delegate, up at Washington-on-the-Brazos again as a delegate, appointed Vice President of the Republic, interim Vice President of the Republic, and even though he wasn't an active participant in the battle, would be in the area of San Jacinto. David G. Burnett was a judge here before the revolution. He was a hanger-on at the convention, appointed interim president. While Santa Anna didn't make it quite that far north, you know, he's still passing through San Felipe. Sam Houston with the Texas Army, when he's retreating east, he is passing again through San Felipe, then heading up to towards Washington-on-the-Brazos to reconvene with the government. It's all those little connections that we find just about every day between each of the three sites. That's always fascinating. And it's also the point where some of us have been around for a while and familiar with the story. It's you know, reading a letter, primary source from the time period, then getting a minute reference in the corner. It's like, oh, met with so-and-so over at, it's like, oh, I remember that letter and that meeting. I can't remember it off the top of my head because it was a year ago, but I know what they're talking about. And finding all those small, subtle ways that we are linked together. So we're clearly only a few of the Texas revolutionaries related sites in the Texas Historical Commission system. So one of the other ones out towards Goliad, of course, is the Fannin Battleground State Historic Site. And this is where Colonel Fannin and his elements of the Army were, you know, caught up with by the Mexican Army. The Battle of Colito Creek took place on these grounds. Ultimately, Colonel Fannin surrendered to the Mexican Army, and they would be marched back to Goliad for General Urrea to, you know, hold them for a few days until ultimately the order from Santa Anna came through to massacre them.
So both of these sites are both Barrington Plantation and Fanthorpe Inn State Historic Site fall under sort of a great umbrella that we have here at Washington-on-the-Brazos. And both of these have the distinction of being both Republic of Texas sites and loosely affiliated with the Texas Revolution. Barrington Plantation was the home of Dr. Anson Jones, who was the last president of the Republic of Texas, also a veteran of the Battle of San Jacinto. But that is now operated here on the grounds of Washington-on-the-Brazos as a living history farm. And for my money, if you've never been to Washington or if you've never been to Barrington, it's the best living history farm, or in my opinion, the best living history farm in the state of Texas, and really one of the top living history sites in the nation as far as authenticity and quality of living history interpretation. So if you've never had a chance to experience life in the 1850s in a farm here in Texas, definitely need to come out and visit Barrington. And then over in the town of Anderson, we have Fanthorpe Inn State Historic Site, which was a stagecoach inn operated by Henry Fanthorpe, who was an English immigrant who arrived in Texas in 1832 and established an inn a couple years later as a wedding gift for his wife, Rachel Kennard. This inn is a model of the sort of Texas commercial spirit. Henry and his wife and family would expand and open the inn to be one of the finest establishments in the Republican state of Texas. It operated from 1834 all the way through the Civil War until 1868. And it truly is a model of Texas entrepreneurship and commercial endeavor. And it's largely original. So it's also a great chance to come and learn about early Texas Anglo architecture in our state. So that's over in the town of Anderson, about 20 miles from Washington. If you haven't been there either, it's open Friday through Sunday all year long. So come and visit us some weekend.
Krychek Brewery and Monument Hill State Historic Site, again, the connection throughout, as Kevin and Jordan have talked about, the people connected throughout. And then there's the whole question of, the Texas Revolution arguably ended at San Jacinto, but then there was Treaty of Alaska, and there was ongoing skirmishes all the way up till statehood. And then, arguably the Mexican-American War was really the final time where Mexico finally signed over. So when did the Texas Revolution end? We have the Mirror Expedition of Dawson Massacres represented those men who were killed, the Black Bean Massacre. Their bodies were brought back to LaGrange, in 1848 and interned in this grave overlooking the Colorado River on the bluffs. Shortly thereafter, Krychek, German immigrant, came and bought the land and established a brewery, which you might have noticed from my picture earlier. They've recreated that beer, and it's quite fine sipping if that's your inclination. But these sites together, I really love, and I have a special place in my heart for Monument Hill. It's a place I've gone since very early on. To me, it parallels San Jacinto a great deal. 1848, they interred the bodies, but it wasn't until 1907 that the state acquired it, and that's the same time period that San Jacinto became its first state park. And then the current obelisk and memorial that is there at Monument Hill was put in place in 1936, the same time period that the San Jacinto monument was erected in that centennial, when we were honoring really the centennial of Texas. And it went beyond just some of the sites that we've talked about, obviously in Monument Hill. So great little spot to visit in LaGrange, great little town, and just a real jewel in the THC list of historic sites.
So Varner Hog Plantation has a connection to the Texas Revolution because for a short period of time, the original owners of the plantation home, the Pattons, the Patton family owned the home. General Santa Anna was held prisoner at this plantation. So it's not a large battle or anything like that, but it does tie into the Texas Revolutionary story. And Andy touched on it. Yes, many people wanted Santa Anna to be killed. And this is one of those places that Santa Anna was held for a short period of time. And someone made a comment just now, whether or not the Texas Historical Commission has any plans for Fort Titlan. That is something that we forgot to put into this PowerPoint. And I am not that closely involved with that site, but I'm not entirely sure of any plans at this moment in time, what they intend to do with it. We are the Texas Historical.
And I have the privilege of talking about Casa Navarro in San Antonio. A lot of you, I'm sure, probably have been or are familiar with the Alamo. And there's so much history in San Antonio that if you only go to San Antonio to see the Alamo, you've certainly seen a great place in Texas history, but you gotta branch out and you gotta see more that's there. And I can't recommend Casa Navarro enough. This was the home of Jose Antonio Navarro, who, like I mentioned earlier, was one of only two native-born Texans to sign the Texas Declaration of Independence. And his original home there is in San Antonio. And Jose Navarro was a true Texan. Born in 1795, he was a San Antonio native. He was a lawyer. He had supported independence for just about any cause. He fought for Texas and supported it. The Gutierrez-McGee expedition in the early 18 teens, he supported against the Spanish. He represented Coahuila y Tecas in the state legislature and in the federal Congress, was a supporter of Texas statehood. Obviously, he supported independence and was elected to attend the convention of 1836. He was a big advocate for Tejano rights in the Republic of Texas. He was a supporter of Mirabeau B. Lamar in the election of 1840, or excuse me, the election of 1838. He actually spoke out and was a political opponent of Sam Houston during Sam Houston's two administrations. He was a commissioner for the Texas government during the ill-fated Santa Fe expedition in 1842, and then was imprisoned in Veracruz before escaping and coming back to Texas after 14 months. He supported annexation. He was a delegate to the convention of 1845 to see Texas brought into the United States. And then he would turn around 15 years later and support Texas's secession from the Union during the Civil War. So he was, again, he was a Texan through and through, and he fought for Texas. And if you've never had a chance to study this phenomenal figure in our history, really encourage you to go down to Casa Navarro there in downtown San Antonio.
So we're gonna, sorry, go ahead, Kevin. I'm gonna get you some
I was gonna
questions
say-
and answers. Yeah, I apologize. I've had some technical issues tonight, but we do have some great questions from everybody. I apologize. We're running along. We've got a great audience, and I think you've enjoyed the speakers. We don't want to keep you here all night. So many of you are asked some dive deep type of questions. We may try to get back to you via email here in the next couple of days, but I wanted to get a few out for everyone. Andy, there was an early question about the flags at the Alamo, and the reference, of course, that there are several potential flags that have been proposed as possibly being at the Alamo. Is there concrete evidence either way supporting any of them? Other than the flag that Santa Anna captured from the New Orleans Grays, I'm not sure there is, but you want to comment on that? Andy, you want to take a stab at that?
The flags in San Jacinto is really, and these are the flags we fly in front of the monument. That's a whole big can of worms. I referenced the 1824 flag, and I didn't mean to say factually that we know it was there. There is there's some evidence that it might have been. The only flags that we really know for sure from the Texas Revolution are basically the Lady Liberty San Jacinto flag, which is at the in Texas Capitol, and then the New Orleans Grays that you referenced. There were a couple of Mexican battalion flags that were captured in San Jacinto that we have evidence of, but a lot of the flags are conjecture. One of my favorite conjectures is Jordan's over his shoulder. That was probably, we don't know if that was ever actually, we've seen the drawings of it, but I don't know if it was actually made. So no, I didn't mean to imply that it absolutely was definitely flown there. There is some evidence that it was, but I like the symbolism of it because, again, at the Alamo, I believe a lot of those people initially were advocates for the Mexican Constitution and not necessarily full-blown independence. They just wanted to the freedoms afforded by that Constitution.
Very good. So I just want to share with the panel, we had an occasional volunteer, certainly a visitor to our sites, send me an email question at 2 o'clock, which may have had as much homework put into it as you all did in getting ready for this session. So in fairness to him, I'm going to pose this question on behalf of Glenn Hadler, who's a bit of a defender of Sam Houston, it sounds like. He's asking, is it not true that Houston acted prudently as a commander by choosing to fight only under favorable conditions with a chance to fall back into a wooded defensive position if necessary? Do you all agree that Sam Houston seems to have chosen wisely at the Battle of San Jacinto?
Absolutely. There's a lot to the battle, the actual 18-minute battle, and the tactics of it. The sun would have been at his back. He had tactical position. Even Santa Anna's own troops had afterwards were questioning Santa Anna's choice of where he picked on the field of battle, and Sam Houston's foresight in sending Jeff Smith to go burn Vince's Bridge, so there was no retreat. Santa Anna's troops being with their backs against the marsh, no escape. It was very tactically wise. Someone I think made a comment that Sam Houston camping in the trees really negated Santa Anna's strength, his cavalry. Sam Houston had more guns, so he had the artillery advantage, and he took absolute advantage of that. There is a lot to the argument, and we could go on and on almost as much as we could about flags, about the genius of Sam Houston at San Jacinto. There are many people that fall on both sides of that fence. I think the results show that however he got to the point, it was a good decision tactically. It ended up successfully. It could have easily gone the other way. We all know that. But it seems that he made a lot of very good decisions on that fateful day.
I think the comments you referenced actually were put forward by the questioner. So they're obviously very actively engaged, and someone who's pretty big into this story.
And I'll weigh in on that real quick too, Brian, because over my shoulder I have Mosley Baker, who is definitely in the not Sam Houston camp. He was not a fan of Sam Houston even before the revolution really started heating up, before he was placed in charge of the town's militia. He refused to retreat any further east with Sam Houston. And after some political disagreements during the time of the Republic, he pens a very long letter stating all the things that he believes Sam Houston did wrong and incorrectly throughout the entire campaign. And having read that letter, yes, there are likely plenty of opportunities, just like there is in any campaign, that had Sam Houston known all the information, yeah, in retrospect, it looks like a mistake. He cites Sam Houston's withdrawal from the Colorado River, not fording across the river to attack Sesma's units, saying, oh, his closest reinforcements were hundreds of miles away. We could have taken this force. But this is all with information that Mosley Baker knows for a fact years after the campaign had taken. Sam Houston has a trickle of information coming to him. There is no solid way for him to know where those other detachments were. So he is very much weighing his decisions, and I think he played some situations intelligently. There's a few things where it's just like, okay, in retrospect, maybe not the best choice, but he likely knew that he had very limited choices, and tried to make sure it was a sure thing. If there was going to be an engagement, it was going to be a sure thing. That means he made a number of unpopular decisions along the way, and we can criticize them all we want, and there's plenty of things to criticize him on. But he did the best he could with the situation, the hand he was dealt. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and to Jordan's point, it's one of the fascinating things about this is there's contemporary debate in Sam Houston's lifetime about this, and then here we are nearly 200 years later, continuing to evaluate and assess. So nice that we have that luxury as Texans whose freedom was born on these battlefields. Kevin, I had a logistical question. I just want to give you a swing at. Someone is planning to be at Washington-on-the-Brazos on March 2nd. I know your annual event is the weekend before, but the question was, are there any specific activities going on March the 2nd? Obviously, your website will update that stuff, but if you know something you want to share, go ahead.
So like you mentioned, Brian, and like you saw, or like you answered on that question in the chat, our big focus for Texas Independence is our main event, which will be February 26th and 27th. Now, that said, we will do a couple of readings of the Declaration of Independence on March 2nd. We have some groups who are going to come out and have private ceremonial meetings inside Independence Hall in the morning on March 2nd. It's in the middle of the week. It's a Wednesday. And again, traditionally, our focus is to celebrate Texas independence on whichever weekend happens to fall closest to March 2nd. Sometimes we're fortunate in that March 2nd falls on a Saturday or Sunday. This weekend, we're not so, or this year, we're not so fortunate because March 2nd falls right smack in the middle of the week. So we've opted to celebrate on 26th and 27th. And I saw that question to the asker. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Kurt, I would certainly encourage you, if you're able, do come join us the weekend before on the 26th and the 27th. If not, when you come on Wednesday the 2nd, you're more than welcome to tour the grounds. We'll give you a tour of Independence Hall. What a special time to be in Independence Hall on the anniversary of Texas independence. And you can also take advantage of all the rest of the site has to offer: Barrington, the Star of the Republic Museum, all of that. So we look forward to seeing you whenever you happen to visit.
All right, Joe, and the last question that I've saved for each of you to take a swing if you'd like, asks, if you were to lay the credit or blame as you see it for the onset or the bringing on of the Texas Revolution, as it were, at the feet of any one individual, who would you give the credit or blame to for the Texas Revolution occurring as an historical event? It's a tough question. I'm sure they're curious as to whether you could personalize it that well. Anybody got any thoughts?
Well, one name that does rise to the top is going to be William Barrett Travis. He led an attack on Anahuac in 1832, and then again in 1835. However, when he led the attack in 1835, in July of 1835, it doesn't garner the support that he initially thought it would. In fact, there are many town councils that would convene and write to the Mexican government basically saying, we're not with that guy. That guy's kind of crazy. We're not going to arrest him and hand him over to you or anything, but we're totally not in agreement with what that guy did. And he'd even have his detractors publish articles saying what he did was reckless. So he was definitely an instigator, but there are also folks working in the background who are also proponents for this. We have three-legged Willie. Mosley Baker over here, after the assault at Anahuac, spends a lot of his time going through East Texas trying to raise volunteers. This results in Santa Anna and the Mexican Army government sending a letter to Texas saying, okay, well, we're not quite sure what's going on at the moment, but arrest these people and send them into us. Mosley Baker's on the list, soon to be General of the Texas Army for a short time. Francis Johnson, who's also trying to raise volunteers, is placed on there. Lorenzo de Zavala is placed on that list because he's a political opponent of Santa Ana, and William Barrett Travis are on this list. Whether or not Texans were going to arrest these people and turn them over to the government was considered here in San Felipe and denied. And that was the ultimate, okay, guys, we're not arresting these folks. Prepare your militias. We're not quite sure what's going to happen, but y'all need to be ready.
Anybody else have a thought on who gets credit for the Texas Revolution?
Santa Ana. No,
Yeah,
Yeah, he does get a lot of it.
sorry.
I
Hey,
was gonna
we
say-
wanted that.
I think that may have been where the questioner was going, although she was very pleased with Jordan's answer. So she liked Travis. All right.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Kevin.
I was gonna say, I certainly think, and I see other commenters are, putting the blame at the feet of Santa Ana. I mean, that's kind of where I lean. Obviously, I think Edith there was, like you said, very happy with William Barrett Travis. I mean, you could make credible claims, arguments about so many people. I mean, what role did Hayden Edwards play in the Texas Revolution? Well, were it not for the Fregonian Rebellion, we wouldn't have had the law of April 6th. Were it not for the law of April 6th, we wouldn't have had Texas's attempt at statehood. Without that, you wouldn't have had Stephen F. Austin's arrest, and then the Anahuac disturbance, or the second Anahuac disturbance, and all that. I mean, there's so many things, but ultimately, like Andy said, and I largely agree, one singular person caused the Texas Revolution: Antonio Lopez de Santana.
He's mentioned in the Declaration by name, is he not? So there you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all, gentlemen, and I appreciate most of our audience has stuck around for our extended time, and so we try to nail these programs down to about an hour, but we appreciate all of you joining us tonight and hanging in there with us. We've got a couple of housekeeping slides that we want to share with you, just a little information. So we're pleased that we have launched a new line of Texas Revolution themed products. And someone mentioned Wade Dillon earlier, his work at Velasco. He's also a great artist. He helped us with these products. And so we want to celebrate him and his efforts as well. So you're going to see here in a second, here are 5 male revolutionaries. I'm going to let you play trivia. These are fairly obvious. You can get answers to who these are by visiting our shops or visiting our website if they're confusing to any of you. We also have a slide where we did a similar piece for women of Texas, women revolutionaries, and there they are. So these all typically have some kind of site association with one of our sites or one of the significant sites of Texas independence. The next slide is going to show you how you can break out your credit cards and checkbooks and whatever and enjoy product emblazoned with those great new designs. We're going to be having a 20% sale on product for any of these at our stores. Currently, the gift shops that carry this merchandise are at Casa Navarro, San Jacinto, Washington-on-the-Brazos, and here at San Felipe de Austin. That discount is available to anyone who requests it, which gives us the impression you might have seen this program tonight through Valentine's Day. You can also make this purchase by giving us a call at any of these sites. We can ship to you if you're not going to be able to see one of the sites. It's rare for us to be able to promote product like this at multiple places. So we're really excited to be able to let you know this product is out there, and maybe we'll see you wearing it at one of our sites soon. The next couple of slides, just to give you a little heads up on the program itself. So we want to thank all of our behind the scenes team, including the FaceTime guys today. Here's a list of a number of our site staff, our agency and division administration. Bill Irwin, my direct boss, gave someone a short answer about the twin sisters earlier and the prospect that they might have been used during the Civil War. So we appreciate that you guys are such a knowledgeable audience. Some of the questions that were asked and even comments made could have supported their own History at Night program. So we're taking notes. We'll be aware of that possibility as we go forward. So thank you all for supporting the site again. On behalf of the Friends of San Felipe de Austin and the Texas Historical Commission, we're really excited to have had you out tonight. Here are your panelists from this evening. They were bold enough and brave enough to let us share their emails with you. So if you have specific questions you want to ask to them, screenshot that now. We also have your email information from your registration. And it's entirely possible that for those of you that asked questions or made some pointed comments, you may hear back from us in the next few days. If you really enjoyed the program and wish you could see it again or rewind or catch somebody in a moment, or maybe better, recommend it to a friend who didn't think to join tonight or wasn't aware that these kind of opportunities are out there. We are recording the session and it will be posted in the next few days. So that link will go up on our Facebook page, and we'll try to get it spread out with the other participants so they can share it with you as well. Thank you all very much. We've really enjoyed having you with us here at San Felipe de Austin. We hope you keep an eye out for more exciting History at Night programs and for any number of public history programs at these sites that are brought to you by the Texas Historical Commission.